It was August 1944. The sun over Texas was merciless, the kind of heat that melted tar and made the horizon shimmer. A train rattled across the plains, dragging behind it a string of boxcars filled with young men in torn gray uniforms. The air inside smelled of sweat, fear, and dust. These men were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, once proud, now silent. Captured in North Africa and Normandy, they had crossed the Atlantic believing they were being taken to some bleak American prison camp where they would be worked, beaten, and forgotten. When the train finally screeched to a stop, the guards shouted, "All right, fellas, into the line." The POWs blinked against the blinding light. Instead of concrete walls and rifles, they saw endless open land, waving grass, tall fences made of wood, and beyond that, herds of cattle moving slow under the sun. A sign near the gate read simply, "Camp Huntsville, U.S. Army Prisoner of War Branch." Heinz Mueller, 22, from Munich, squinted through the glare. He thought, this can't be a prison. Outside the camp, a group of local ranchers stood with their hats tilted low, waiting. Among them was Tom McAllister, owner of the Red River Ranch. He was in his 40s, wiry, with hands that looked carved from rope. The Army had asked for volunteers to take a few POWs to help on nearby ranches. The cotton was high, and half the local men were still overseas. Tom spat tobacco into the dust and muttered, "Don't look like killers to me." The sergeant shrugged. "They're tired, that's all. But they'll work hard. We keep an eye on them." Heinz and 7 other Germans were marched toward a flatbed truck. They expected to be shackled, but the soldiers only waved them forward. One cowboy tossed them canteens and said, "Hot one today. Drink up, boys." No one moved. They thought it was a trick. Tom grinned. "Go on. Ain't poisoned." When Heinz finally took a sip, the water was cold, painfully cold, like a memory of home. They rode for an hour across the prairie, watching mesquite trees pass like ghosts. At last, the truck stopped beside a corral where horses stamped the dirt. The Germans stiffened. "Horses?" The sergeant said, "All right, McAllister, they're yours. Just don't let 'em near town." Tom nodded and motioned toward the corral. "Let's see what they can do." He pointed to Heinz and another POW, Carl Becker, a broad-shouldered mechanic from Hamburg. "You two ever ride?" They didn't understand, so he mimed swinging a leg over a saddle. Carl hesitated, then nodded shyly. He had ridden once, years ago, before the war. Tom whistled, and a chestnut mare was brought out. "She's gentle," he said. "Her name's Rosie. Let's see if you remember how." Carl froze. A cowboy was actually inviting him, a German prisoner, to ride a horse? The camp guards leaned on the fence, half amused. Carl swung his leg over, clumsy but steady. Rosie shifted beneath him, snorting in the heat. The other POWs watched, speechless. Tom slapped the horse's flank, and Rosie moved forward at a slow walk. Carl's posture straightened, his face split into a smile, the first since capture. The others started to laugh and clap, and even the guards couldn't help grinning. Heinz wrote about it that night in his small notebook. "Today they let us touch freedom. For a few minutes, the wind didn't smell of war." That night, under the wide Texas sky, they ate beans and bread by the fire.
The Cowboys didn't talk much, but they didn't have to. One handed Heinz a cup of coffee, another tossed him a blanket. He looked around at these men, sunburned, quiet, their rifles leaning against a fence post, and thought how strange it was that kindness could exist here, between enemies, in a place that didn't even supposed to feel real.
The next morning started before dawn. Heinz woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of dust. He sat up on his cot, blinking at the dim light that crept through the cracks of the wooden bunkhouse. Outside, he could hear the horses snorting, the clink of metal buckets, the low hum of cowboys talking as they prepared for another day. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of coffee and hay. Tom McAllister pushed open the door and said in his rough but kind drawl, "All right, boys, saddle up. The cattle don't care what uniform you used to wear." Heinz didn't catch every word, but he understood the gesture. Tom tossed him a piece of bread and a tin cup of coffee. It was bitter, black, and strong, the kind of taste that woke you up from months of numbness. The POWs were divided into small groups and sent to different chores. Some fixed fences, some helped stack hay. Heinz and Carl were sent to the corral with Tom. The sun rose fast, painting everything gold. By noon, their shirts were soaked with sweat. Tom watched them work, impressed. "Y'all aren't half bad," he said, half to himself. "Guess hard work don't care what side you're on." Heinz smiled, not understanding, but catching the tone. That afternoon, Tom called Heinz over. "You," he said, pointing, "you ride with me today." He handed him the reins of a tall bay horse named Duke. Heinz hesitated, then nodded. They rode side by side across the ranch, checking fences and guiding cattle. At first, Heinz was tense, gripping the reins too tight. But soon the rhythm took over. The sway of the saddle, the creak of leather, the dry wind on his face. He looked around at the open land, endless, empty, peaceful. He thought of Europe, the rubble, the fear, the smoke, and for a moment he couldn't believe the two worlds existed at the same time. Tom noticed the faraway look in his eyes. "It's a hell of a thing, isn't it? All this space." Heinz nodded. "Yeah. Free," he said softly. "What's that?" He pointed at the horizon. "Free." Tom grinned. "Yeah, that's Texas, son." As weeks passed, word spread among locals that the crowd prisoners at McAllister's ranch weren't dangerous. In fact, people started calling them the polite Germans. The camp commander noticed too. The men worked hard, didn't try to escape, and respected the rules. He told Tom, "I reckon you're doing something right. Never seen prisoners laugh so much." Tom shrugged. Maybe they just needed a job and some sun. But not everyone approved. Some townsfolk whispered that it wasn't right, treating enemies like neighbors. One evening when Tom rode into town for supplies, a man at the feed store muttered, "Next thing you know, you'll be inviting them to Sunday dinner." Tom just smiled. "Maybe I will." By late September, Heinz had learned to throw a lasso. Not perfectly, but enough to catch a post or two. Every evening, the Cowboys took turns teaching him, cheering when he managed a clean throw. One night, as they sat around the fire, Carl said quietly, "In Germany, we had no sky like this." Heinz nodded. "Or people like them." A cowboy named Pete looked up from his coffee. "People are just people, friend. War don't change that." That night, Heinz wrote in his notebook again. "They talk of freedom like a song. I think I am learning the words." One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. The wind howled, the sky turned black, and the horses panicked. Tom shouted orders, running toward the corral. A gate had broken loose and several horses bolted into the open field. Without thinking, Hines grabbed a rope and ran after them. The guards yelled, "Stop! You'll get yourself shot if you leave the perimeter!" But he didn't stop. He chased the runaway mare into the storm, rain slashing his face, mud sucking at his boots. Lightning cracked overhead. He reached the horse, Rosie, trembling and tangled in barbed wire. He knelt, whispering softly in German, cutting the wire with his bare hands. By the time Tom and the others reached him, his hands were bleeding, his face streaked with mud, but the horse was safe. Tom stared at him for a moment, then said quietly, "You damn fool, you could have been killed." Hines looked up, breathless. "No chains," he said in broken English. "Only horse." Tom laughed, a loud, genuine laugh that echoed over the rain. He clapped Hines on the shoulder. "All right, son, guess you're one of us now." That night, the Cowboys brought Hines an old leather belt and carved into it the words, "Free Rider." He wore it every day after that. Autumn came quietly to Texas. The grass turned gold, the wind softened, and the fields that once shimmered with heat now breathed cool air under the wide blue sky. For the prisoners, the days blurred together, mornings of hard work, evenings of quiet laughter, and nights filled with the soft hum of crickets. They were still soldiers, still captives, but something in them had changed. Hines often woke before sunrise. He'd walk out past the corral to where the land rolled out like an ocean. Some mornings, Tom would join him with 2 cups of coffee. They wouldn't talk much. They didn't need to. One day, while fixing a fence post near the ranch house, Hines met Eleanor, Tom's daughter. She was 19 with a sunburned nose and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was carrying a basket of eggs and humming a tune he didn't know. When she saw him, she froze for a second, a German in a POW patch standing among the horses. But Hines smiled, awkwardly, and tipped his hat the way he'd seen Tom do. She hesitated, then smiled back. "You speak English?" she asked. "Little," he said, his accent thick. "That's more than most folks round here speak German." They both laughed, quietly, almost nervously. It was the first time Hines had heard the sound of a woman's laughter in over 2 years. Over the weeks, they crossed paths often, when she brought lunch to the men working or carried supplies to the barn. They never spoke long. A few words here, a shy smile there, but something unspoken grew between them, something neither dared to name. One evening, when the sun was setting in streaks of fire, Hines saw her standing by the corral watching Rosie graze. He walked over and said softly, "You like horses?" "Always have," she said. "Daddy taught me to ride before I could read." "He teach you rope, too?" She laughed. "Tried. I nearly roped his hat instead." "Better than roping me." She blushed, looking down. Tom watched from the porch, arms crossed, but said nothing. He trusted the boy, trusted him more than some of his own men. In May 1945, the news came that the war in Europe was over. The camp erupted in cheers from both sides. The guards played music. The prisoners stood in stunned silence at first, then clapped, laughed, and some cried. Hines didn't know what to feel. Freedom had always been the dream, but now that it was real, it frightened him. That night, he sat by the fire while the Cowboys talked about homecomings and new beginnings. Pete asked him, "You'll be going back to Germany now, huh?" Hines stared into the flames. "Maybe," he said softly. "But what is Germany now?" Tom said nothing for a long time, then took a sip of coffee. "Son, sometimes home ain't where you're from. It's where you stop running." Hines looked up at the stars, thinking of Eleanor's laughter, of the wide Texas sky, of the way Rosie's hooves sounded against the dirt. He had been a prisoner,
But out here, among horses and dust, he'd found something that felt more like freedom than anything before the war. A few weeks later, he received a letter from his mother, the first in 2 years. It was short, written in trembling handwriting. Our home is gone. Your father did not survive, but you are alive. That is enough. Come home when you can. He folded the paper slowly and put it in his pocket. That night, he walked out to the corral and found Eleanor there again. "You got a letter?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "My mother. She says, home is gone." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be. I have home here now." She looked at him for a long moment, then stepped closer. The cicadas buzzed, the wind moved through the grass. For the first time, he reached out and touched her hand. Tom saw from the porch again and turned away quietly.
By autumn, the orders came. The remaining POWs would be shipped back to Europe. The trucks lined up outside the camp, engines rumbling, soldiers calling names from a clipboard. Heinz stood with his small bag, staring at Rosie in the paddock. Tom walked over, holding the horse's reins. "She's yours," he said. "Can't take her across the ocean, but she'll remember you." Heinz smiled faintly. "I will remember her, too." Then Tom handed him an envelope, folded, unmarked. "From Eleanor," he said softly. "She didn't want you to leave without it." Heinz hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single line written in neat handwriting. "Wherever you go, find the sky again." He looked up at Tom, eyes glassy. "Tell her, Danke." "I will, son." The convoy moved out. Dust rose behind the trucks until they disappeared over the ridge. 2 years later, in 1947, a stranger rode up the dirt road toward McAllister Ranch. He was thin, tanned, wearing an old cowboy hat and boots dusty from the trail. Tom was mending a fence when he saw him. The man stopped his horse, smiled, and said in slow, careful English, "You have work for one more rider?" Tom looked at him for a long moment, then laughed. "Heinz Mueller, I'll be damned." Heinz grinned, tipping his hat. "Told you, I find sky again." And just like that, the war was gone. At least in that small corner of Texas, where a German once expected chains and found something far greater.
In the summer of 1944, the war had turned cold and cruel. Across the ocean, in the heart of the United States, the land looked untouched, wide fields of dust and light, windmills turning slowly under a golden sun. It was here that thousands of German prisoners arrived, far from everything they had known. They expected punishment, barbed wire, and the cold stare of their captors. Instead, they found something different, something they couldn't name. When the train stopped in the middle of the plains, the men were silent. No towers, no stone walls, just open sky and the sound of cattle in the distance. The camp itself looked almost like a small town. Wooden barracks, a mess hall, a few guards leaning against trucks. The Americans who ran it didn't shout. They gave short orders, then moved on. Most of them were farmers, ranchers, or men who had already seen enough of war to hate it. The prisoners were taken to work, not to break stones, but to help on ranches and fields nearby. For men who had expected chains, it felt like a strange mistake. They were handed gloves instead of shackles, shovels instead of rifles, and sometimes reins instead of rope. On one of those ranches, the Cowboys looked at the new arrivals with curiosity more than anger. They didn't see soldiers. They saw tired men, thin and pale, blinking in the sunlight like they'd just stepped into another world. The first day, a group of them stood by the corral, unsure what to do. One cowboy motioned toward a horse and pointed at the saddle. The Germans hesitated. They didn't understand. Then the man laughed, handed one of them the reins, and simply nodded. The moment the young prisoner climbed into the saddle, something shifted. For the first time in months, he felt the rhythm of the ground beneath him, the weight of the wind in his hair, the scent of life instead of iron and smoke. The guards watched, half amused, half uncertain, but no one stopped it. That day, the camp felt less like a prison. Days turned into weeks. The Germans learned how to mend fences, move cattle, and ride under the burning Texas sun. Their hands, once soft from city work or factory labor, hardened like the earth they touched. The cowboys began to treat them like workers instead of prisoners. Sometimes at dusk, both sides would sit around the same fire, sharing food and silence. The cowboys would talk about the weather, about cattle prices, about their families. The Germans listened, and though they barely understood, the tone told them everything. There was no hatred in those voices, just fatigue and something close to respect. One of the men later wrote in his journal, "We were not prisoners here. We were men without guns, living as if the war had ended already." The ranchers of Texas didn't see themselves as heroes. They needed help, and the prisoners worked hard. That was all there was to it. But somewhere between work and rest, something human returned to those who had forgotten what it felt like. The war had stolen names, faces, even languages. But here, on this land, everything slowed down. When a storm swept across the plains one evening, the men worked side by side to save the horses and cattle. They fought the wind and rain together, shouting words neither side fully understood. When it was over, they sat drenched and shivering around a lantern, laughing like fools. No one wrote that moment in the official records, but for the men who lived it, it became the memory they carried back across the ocean. When the war finally ended, many of the prisoners were told they would soon go home. But for some, the word home no longer meant the same thing. They had left behind a Germany buried under ashes. What waited for them there was not peace, but emptiness. In letters written years later, some of the men spoke of the ranches, of the open fields, the sound of boots on dry soil, the smell of coffee in the mornings. They wrote of the cowboys who treated them as equals, not enemies, and of the strange freedom they had found in captivity. One letter simply said, "In Texas, I learned to breathe again." Some of those prisoners never went back. After the war, they returned to America, not as captives, but as workers, farmers, and husbands. They built lives in the same places that had once held them behind fences. Many of their children would grow up never knowing that their fathers had once worn the wrong uniform. The land had changed them. The war had taken everything, but the wide, endless sky had given something back.
In the summer of 1944, a train crossed the American plains carrying German prisoners of war. Most of them were young men who had fought in North Africa or France. They were tired, silent, and certain of what awaited them: barbed wire, punishment, and years of humiliation. When the train stopped in the heart of Texas, the men stepped down expecting to see watchtowers and armed guards. Instead, they found open land that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air smelled of dust and hay. Somewhere in the distance, cattle moved lazily across the dry fields. The camp they were taken to looked more like a small town than a prison. Wooden barracks, a mess hall, and a few American soldiers leaning against trucks. The guards did not shout. They gave short instructions and moved on. The men were confused. A few days later, several of the prisoners were sent out to work on nearby ranches. They thought they were being punished. But when the truck stopped at the ranch gates, what they saw defied every expectation they had. Cowboys stood waiting, broad hats, leather boots, sunburned faces. Some of them nodded politely,
Others simply kept working. The prisoners were handed gloves instead of chains, tools instead of rifles. They were told to work, to help repair fences and feed the animals. For men who had expected to be treated as monsters, it was an unthinkable kindness. At first, the Germans worked in silence. The Cowboys didn't speak German, and most of the prisoners barely understood English. But work has its own language. In the long hours under the sun, gestures became sentences, and small smiles replaced fear. The first time one of them was asked to help with the horses, he froze. He thought it was a mistake. But the cowboy just pointed at the saddle and nodded. The German climbed on awkwardly, unsure of what to do. The horse moved forward, slow and steady, and the prisoner felt something he hadn't felt since the war began: calm. From that day on, the routine changed. The men learned to saddle horses, to mend fences, to ride under the burning Texas sky. Their hands hardened, their backs grew strong again, and their eyes started to lift toward the horizon instead of the ground. The locals began to notice. The men in town who had once looked at the prisoners with suspicion started greeting them when they passed by. A few ranch families even brought food to the camp on holidays. The line between captor and captive blurred slowly until it almost disappeared. At night, when the day's work was done, the prisoners often sat near the barns, watching the sun sink into the plains. The silence of that place felt like something holy, a silence that held no anger, no fear, only the hum of insects and the occasional sound of horses moving in their stalls. When winter came, the work slowed down. The prisoners helped repair roofs and chop wood for the ranch. The cowboys shared hot coffee and sometimes let them listen to the radio. They never spoke about the war. It was as if, for a few months, it didn't exist. In May 1945, the war ended. News came over the radio and the camp changed overnight. The Germans cheered quietly. Some cried. Some just stared into the distance. Freedom had returned, but it no longer felt simple. Many of them had lost their homes, their families, their country. The ranchers congratulated them, shook their hands, and thanked them for their hard work. Some prisoners smiled, but their faces were heavy with uncertainty. They had come to Texas as enemies and were leaving as something else. Not friends, perhaps, but men who understood one another. When the time came to leave, the prisoners packed their few belongings. Before boarding the trucks, they looked once more at the open land, at the sky that seemed larger than any they had ever seen. Some of them whispered quietly that they would return one day. Years later, a few did. After the war, some of those men came back to America, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. They worked on farms, built homes, and raised families under the same sky that had once looked down on them in captivity. In letters written decades later, they described those months in Texas as the strangest, most peaceful time of their lives. One wrote simply, "They took away our weapons and gave us work. They gave us horses instead of chains. That is when I truly became free."
By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. But across Texas, thousands of German prisoners of war were still waiting to be sent home. Their uniforms had faded, their boots were worn thin, and most of them no longer spoke much about the world they had left behind. The camps had become quiet places, half farms, half memories. Life followed a rhythm. Each morning, the prisoners worked on nearby ranches, repairing fences, tending fields, or helping with livestock. They had learned to live under the vast sky of the American Southwest, a sky that seemed to have no walls, no boundaries, only the sound of wind moving across the land. The locals had grown used to seeing them. In small towns and rural farms, the German boys were no longer enemies, just workers, polite, reliable, and always on time. That summer, the ranchers in one county decided to hold their annual rodeo, a celebration that had gone on for generations. Cowboys from across the state came to show their skill, riding broncos, roping cattle, and racing under the heat of the sun.
Someone joked that the Germans, who had been working alongside them for nearly a year, should have a chance to compete too. The idea spread. By the end of the week, it wasn't a joke anymore. The camp commander hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. The prisoners were trusted now, and the rodeo grounds were just beyond the town, still within sight of the camp's fences. When the day arrived, the air shimmered with heat. The grandstand was full of families, soldiers, and ranchers. Children waved small American flags. Music from a fiddle echoed through the dry air. Dust rose with every step. The prisoners were brought in on trucks, wearing their work clothes instead of uniforms. They stood uncertainly at first, unsure of how to behave. Then the announcer, standing on the wooden stage, simply called their names. Each German who stepped into the arena carried the same look, nervous, proud, and slightly disbelieving. They had once been soldiers of a defeated army. Now they were competitors in an American rodeo. The events began. The Cowboys rode first, fast, fearless, and loud. The crowd cheered as hats flew and ropes cracked through the air. Then it was the turn of the POWs. The first was a young man who had worked on a nearby ranch for months. He had learned to ride during long days of herding cattle. When he mounted the horse, the crowd grew quiet. The animal reared, dust exploded under its hooves, and for a few brief seconds, the German rider stayed on, balanced, calm, determined. When he finally fell, the audience clapped, not out of pity, but out of respect. More followed. Some tried calf roping, some joined the horse races, and a few helped manage the livestock between events. The boundaries between prisoner and local disappeared in the dust and laughter. By afternoon, the camp guards had stopped watching the fences. The only thing that mattered was the competition. When the final event ended, the ranchers gathered to hand out small prizes, a belt buckle here, a cowboy hat there, and loud applause for everyone who rode. The Germans stood beside the Cowboys, smiling awkwardly, their faces sunburned and bright. That evening, when the sun sank low over the horizon, the prisoners were driven back to camp. The truck bounced along the dirt road, carrying men who were tired but strangely alive. Behind them, the sound of the rodeo still drifted through the warm air, laughter, applause, and the faint echo of country music. For one day, the war had been forgotten. In later years, many of those men wrote about that moment, the day they competed not as soldiers, but as men. They remembered the dust, the horses, and the cheers from people who had once called them enemies. One wrote simply, "That day, I was not a prisoner. I was a rider under the Texas sun." Another added, "It was the first time since the war began that I felt equal. Not forgiven, not feared, just free." Long after they returned to Europe, the memory stayed. The rodeo had lasted only a few hours, but in those hours, the distance between two worlds disappeared. And somewhere in the heart of Texas, the land still remembered the day when the lines of war vanished in the dust of a rodeo arena.